Hi everyone, I'm Hanobi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redmond Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redmond is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at the email I'll be putting into the chat box. As this states, this presentation is not necessarily representative of the views and policies of the DOJ or OVW. All the opinions and recommendations within are those of the author. Presenting with us today is Wyanet Tasker. Wyanet is of the Lumbee and Eastern Band Cherokee tribes and is Redmond's Housing and Homeless Services Tribal Technical Assistance Coordinator. She was previously the Children and Youth Tribal TA Coordinator and has been working with survivors of trauma since 2005. She has direct service experience in the residential treatment facility, school setting, shelter, and housing programs. She has been providing culturally specific training and TA since 2015 and has been developing expertise with special survivor populations such as children and youth, male, Two-Spirit and LGBT+, and survivors with disabilities. She authored Creating a Safe Space to Grow, a guide for tribal child and youth advocacy, and has served as a trainer for Redmond's 40-hour trainings. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box. We will be monitoring it. And I will now turn it over to Wyanet.
Thank you so much, Hanobi, and thank you everyone for being here. Super excited. So this is a part 2. So I will be kind of referencing our part 1 that happened on June 1st. And I'm incredibly appreciative that we had Tor Parker here to do that one. I'll be talking a lot about language because I think that this part 2, we needed to kind of bring it all in together and talk about, we've got these really great ideas. How do you explain it? How do you justify it? What kind of language should you think about when you're writing proposals, when you're presenting ideas? Maybe if you need to go in front of tribal leadership to request help or funds or things like that. If you're applying for grants, those kind of things. I am going to go ahead and post the link. This is our YouTube link to Tor's part 1, in case you missed that. I will also send out a follow-up email after this, once we've got this one posted, to send them as a package. So you'll get a follow-up email with this link in it too. So thinking about language, I was having a conversation with someone who is kind of a mentor to me, and she was talking about how teaching children and youth, how we talk certain ways around different people, and how it's very different when we need to talk to funders, to those people that make decisions around how the money can be used. So an example that happened to me recently, and I'll use examples from direct services, I'll use technical assistance examples from what we're doing right now, to give you kind of a broad view of this language thing. So recently we brought in a new consultant on the Housing and Homeless Services TA project, and I have asked her to write a toolkit, which will be coming out this year, and to do 3 workshops when the toolkit rolls out too, to kind of explain how the toolkit can be used and different kind of background information around the toolkit. And I'm really, really excited about it. When I was talking to our OVW grant manager, I slipped up in my language though, and I called it an MMIW toolkit. Well, she immediately went, what? Because the scope of this Housing and Homeless Services TA project does not include specifically MMIW work. So what I am allowed to work on are domestic violence, sex assault, stalking, dating violence. So the language had to shift, and I knew this, but I was talking casually and I slipped up. But when I wrote the actual proposal, I used the right language so that it could get approved. So when I submit it under Just Grants, when I write formal emails about it, I absolutely have to make sure that I'm using the right language. So it's really more a toolkit on how shelters might want survivors to check in with them so that they know if there's a bed available for the night, or if you're working in transitional housing with a domestic violence survivor, you might have an emergency contact form, but if that person is missing, or when there's a domestic violence homicide, on how to respond to those kind of things. And so it's a little bit of shift in language. So as we go through these slides, I'll try to point out different kind of language pieces that you can use to justify the things you're doing, and so that things don't get flagged. We do get a lot of questions around language, especially with transitional housing. So I keep a notebook specifically for language in this work. If I'm watching a webinar, if I'm reading a book, if I'm researching something online and I see some like catchy phrase or some persuasive language, then I use those ideas later. I'm not going to plagiarize them. I'll cite my sources. But it can help me when I'm thinking about different activities to do, like, oh, they did this really cool thing. I wonder how we could like modify that. Or, wow, they really, really put this in a great way. And I love the way that they stated this. This was a really, really great piece of writing. So I do that too, and that helps me personally. Next slide. I'm going to post this in the chat box too. And this will also come out in an email to you. I like to start out with this unnatural power and control wheel circle. Not anymore. And I love that. It's been modified so that it's a triangle. It's much more culturally appropriate. And I really feel like a lot of people don't understand culturally specific services. So this in general, it takes that power and control wheel, and there's a lot of similarities there. Domestic violence and sexual violence, perpetrators use a lot of the same tactics to maintain and take control. So these are really significant in helping survivors understand and kind of normalize that these tactics are, I know for me personally, I felt abnormal because of some of the things that were done. And this really puts things into perspectives of, you're totally not alone. Like, these other people are using the same kind of thing or similar kind of thing. And it kind of helped me normalize myself, my life, my childhood, those kind of things. But this triangle is an Indigenous perspective, which is what I love about it. So you can see the difference in the mainstream versus the Indigenous examples. When you look at that bottom piece, you'll see that cultural abuse and the ritual abuse. So those are pieces that are not talked about in mainstream advocacy, but it's super, super important when you're thinking about culturally specific advocacy for Indigenous survivors. I went to mainstream support groups when I first started on my healing journey. I love support groups. I love them. It was incredibly beneficial in my healing. But I was not able to talk about the cultural abuse and the ritual abuse at these mainstream programs. I was missing that piece of healing. So there was a gap for me in victim services. So thinking about that language, there's a gap. And there's this cultural side of healing. So I don't want to say this in like an offensive way. I've provided technical assistance to primarily white grant administrators who, when you ask them about culturally specific services, they tend to go to language access, like, oh, hire an interpreter. And that's not the same as culturally specific services. Yes, if you can build in language immersion into your programming, that's wonderful. But that's not it. That's not the entirety of what culturally specific services means. So I will typically use this for them too, to explain that, yeah, language access is incredibly important. But for myself, I am not fluent in my people's language. So offering me an interpreter wouldn't make sense for what I need. What I did need is an advocate who understood that my dad said he was a shapeshifter and that he was able to watch me constantly in this altered form. I need someone who understands and doesn't judge when I say things like, he told me that he would have medicine men pray against me to make me sick and die. That's what I needed. Indigenous people get abused in this way, so we need to heal in this way too. It's access in a different way, it's access on a different scale, and a lot of people don't understand that. So as a part of your justification, you don't have to go overboard and tell people things that are more sacred that you wouldn't feel comfortable talking about. But when you're walking in and asking for some sort of proposal, just understand that there is a lack of understanding around what culturally specific means and why it's necessary. So think about that. Next slide. Okay, we get a ton of questions around this kind of language. So this is a little graphic that explains the differences between emergency shelters, transitional housing, and permanent housing. We get a lot of people, so 60 days after NGO, the new grantee orientations for what we call CTAS, or the Grants to Tribal Governments program, we have NGOs in February. 60 days after that, if you have written into your application that you're going to be doing transitional housing, OVW will start looking for your policy. It's due to them 60 days after NGO. So around this time, people have been getting emails from OVW saying, hey, where's your policies? And they're like, we didn't even know we were supposed to be doing transitional housing, which we also call TH, by the way. So they get in contact with us and they're like, I don't understand what they're asking me for. And I help look through what the application actually said. What did you agree to in your grant? What kind of activities are in there? And so there's a lot of people who are really doing rental assistance. And so that's more of an emergency service. So like 3 to 1 month of rental assistance. But they wrote it up as transitional housing. So again, there's that language piece. If you have transitional housing in your application, it will get flagged because those policies are so important. So shelters, they're the crisis times. They're the immediate response to violence. Transitional housing is really about building stability. So there is a difference there. Transitional housing has to at least be 6 months. So if you do want to offer just short-term crisis emergency rental, really make sure that you're not pushing it into that 6-month place. I would absolutely advise to stick within 3 months or less of rental assistance. Because once you start getting past 3 months, OVW can say, you're getting into longer term rental assistance. You're really pushing this in by definition into transitional housing. So we get a lot of questions about that. We also get questions about emergency shelters and how long they're allowed to be, because a lot of people have like a 30-day limit, a 60-day limit. OVW does not have a limit on how long someone can stay at an emergency shelter, just so you'll know. Permanent housing, we tend to see from like Section 8, things that come out of a housing authority. So those are typically those kind of programs. I worked for a supported permanent housing program before I came to Redwind, and it was for youth, and they would age out at 25. So they would enter at like 18 and then stay until they were 25, longer than transitional housing. So it was that permanent housing, even though they did age out. But typically through housing authorities, it goes longer. So really think about your time limits, really think about your language. I know a lot of you have grant writers who write a grant for the whole tribe, and they don't necessarily check in with advocates before that application goes out. But for everyone to know, there is a big language difference between transitional housing and emergency rental assistance. So keep your eyes open for those kind of things. Next slide. Common shelter barriers. Is anyone willing to give your take on what you would call harm reduction? Is anyone willing to chat in on how you would define harm reduction? Because harm reduction is a big one. The housing and shelter program that I worked for before Red Wind was HUD. Very different rules, very, very different. We did things like, if you don't follow your case plan, you can't stay at the shelter. If you don't do your chores 3 days in a row, you can't stay at the shelter. We did drug testing. And at the time, it was a HUD program and it was allowed. OVW does not allow those things. So while we do absolutely want to create case plans, it really should be more of goals. What are you working on? What are your next steps? What do you want to do while you're here? Where do you see yourself in 6 months? Those kind of things. And we're walking along with them. We're offering support, we're offering resources. I have seen a shelter who handles chores in the way that they had a primary staff member who was like the shelter manager or some, I don't remember what they called her title. But her primary role was really to help families access cultural supports and traditional supports. So how they handled chores is, yes, we ask you to clean up after yourself. However, if you forget, because we all forget, it happens and you're in crisis and you're dealing with trauma. So if you do forget, then the housing manager, the shelter manager, whatever they were called, they'll take care of it. But what that means is during that time that this person is cleaning, they can't be offering these other things. They can't be prepping for these other things, these really fun, exciting activities that they have planned. They can't do that now because they are cleaning. And so it's flipping it a little bit just so that there's some buy-in there. Like, well, I want to do something fun and I want my kids to have access to something fun. So if this person is just cleaning up after everyone, then we don't have access to that. So that can help. There's a lot of reasons that I have seen shelters do these permanent bans, or they call them like red flags. And in HUD, they have HMIS, which is their data software management program. And they can actually flag it in HMIS that someone's been permanently banned from one place. And that could mean that everyone in the county who is also hooked into this HMIS system knows this person's been banned somewhere and won't let this person into the next shelter either. Just caution about when you use these permanent bans and what for, and just using them as little as possible and for the most extreme cases. So yes, I'm seeing a question. We do have tribal grantees in Alaska, absolutely. And there are shelters that get money through the state's Alaska Network on DV and sexual assault. But I wonder if there are grantees that work directly with a federal government grantor. Absolutely, yes. We have a lot of Alaska grantees, so many that at our last conference back in May, we had a specific Alaska breakout track for our Alaska grantees. So definitely, absolutely. Substance abuse, harm reduction. So under HUD, I did a lot of drug testing. I did at the shelter. We do not drug test with OVW money. If you are receiving any OVW money, even if you are having HUD money, you still have to follow the OVW rules. So we still have to follow VAWA. If you're receiving any amount of money from the Violence Against Women Act, you have to follow Violence Against Women Act rules. So even if you're primarily funded by HUD, if you have any funds coming in from OVW, from VAWA, that funding, then you absolutely have to follow those rules around confidentiality too. And things like non-discrimination, like all of the big ones. So we're not investigators. That's not our role. I'm not here to investigate what drugs you're doing. What I am here to do is to have hard conversations with you about how it's causing harm in your life. But if I start drug testing people, then people start hiding it from me. Is drug testing financially sustainable? I'm not really sure what you mean. If you could give me a little more details on that question. But we're having these hard conversations. We're talking about maybe you're drinking on the weekends instead of drinking during the week so that you can make it through your work week. Trying to reduce harm in people's lives. That's really what we're doing, is that harm reduction piece. We, at the program I was at with the lab fees, to going back to the financial sustainability, it got charged to their insurance. So most of the youth at the shelter were on Medicaid. As soon as they got there, we would help them get signed into Medicaid because a lot of them were unemployed and didn't have incomes. And so it was billed through the insurance, but we had a partnership with a local lab where we would send them to if we needed a larger panel, or we would just buy the little test kits that we could use for rapid tests. But we also had a partnership with a local lab that specifically does like detox. I think that's how it worked. It's been a while. I've been at Redwood for a while. I wonder if they're still doing that. I should reach out to them and find out. Criminal history. So I know that when I was working at the shelter, I really didn't have sex trafficking on my radar. I had youth who would come in and say that they had engaged in survival sex, or that they had been repeatedly raped. And I really didn't have the language back then, because this is before I worked in OVW and around VAWA and understood these things enough to be able to verbalize them and have the right terms and have the right language. So I know that I missed things because you're doing an intake and you're just kind of not having the language if it's not something that you've been trained on. And so you just kind of go through your intake and you're like, oh, you know, we can get you services for this, or what kind of support do you need for this? But not necessarily linking that this is a sex trafficking survivor and that they might have specific needs, like having a criminal history because of what they've been forced to do. You know, it might be drug-related charges. It might be prostitution-related charges. So things like that. We don't want to keep them out of shelters because of criminal histories that were completely out of their control. Length of stay. Be as flexible as possible and be realistic about your community. If you just really don't have housing for them to go to, it would be unrealistic for me to say you need to get out in a month. There's nowhere to go. So they're just going to go back to the abuser at that point. And then accessibility. It can be hard to meet everyone's accessibility needs. So we do what we can when we can, and then we do better when we can do better, and just kind of working on those things to make it as accessible as possible. I've seen a lot of shelters who have curfews. You have to be back at 6 and you have to check in or you have to sign in, and then you have to leave during the day. Well, what that did is that for people who had night shift jobs, they were basically sleeping on the streets during the day because the shelter was kicking them out during the day because they should be out looking for work and working. And this person's like, I was working and now you're kicking me out during the day when I need to be sleeping so that I can get to my next shift. So we can accidentally create really punitive policies that create barriers. And it's common. Yeah. Next slide. All right, common housing barriers. Housing climate. You might have heard of this as like the housing market. Where I am, our housing market is awful. I think it's very common all around the nation. I work on the national level. I get to talk to people from all over the country, and it's horrible right now. Things are really bad. So it is a seller's market. The seller is going to make a lot of money and the buyer is going to be in over their head with debt. It's just not a good situation for a lot of us. And then most communities have more need than availability. Where is there to go? We just don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the buildings. We don't have enough housing. Landlords, housing authorities, leasing offices, whatever kind of term they go through. They'll have different relationships with each tenant and with your program. That can create barriers. So how your landlords, how your housing authorities, how they feel about survivors of sexual and domestic violence can create barriers, or how they feel about your program in particular. So if you have someone who's about to apply and they tell the landlord, oh yeah, I'm going to be getting this rental assistance or this transitional housing assistance from this program, and they don't like you, it can create a barrier. Try to buy landlords coffee once in a while or something. I don't know, make them some fried bread and like try to build that relationship with them. Explain the dynamics of domestic violence. And we'll get down to partnership building with landlords, housing authorities, and get into kind of specifics with that in a little bit. But it can make a difference. We don't want to burn our bridges for survivors. So as much as you can network is beneficial for survivors. Credit and criminal history. Poor credit scores are super common. Our survivors are economically abused on purpose so that they can't leave. They're blamed for the violence, they're blamed for property destruction, they're blamed for evictions when this was stuff that was completely out of their control. And again, special considerations for sex trafficking survivors who might have criminal histories. This can be, you can talk about this with landlords in a very generalized way, not to call people out, but start talking to them early so that when situations come up, you've already talked about it. And so that it's also not linked to one of your survivors rather than, hey, I'm just educating you about sex trafficking. Not necessarily like, oh, I have this new person and I need to talk to you about sex trafficking. So the sooner you do it, the better. Really start educating all of our partners. Income, the quote industry standard is that 30% or less of our annual incomes should go towards housing. But the reality is that most of us are paying much, much more on housing. And then another housing barrier is capacity. So you're working with a survivor who has 3 children. How are you going to find somewhere that has enough bedrooms? That's really hard. And then overcrowding and this term network impoverishment. So network impoverishment is, I get an apartment with my brother. My brother loses his job. He doesn't get a new job for 9 months. So during that time, our overall household income is lower. That's what network impoverishment is. It's that when you have more people in the household who could be distributing that cost and they're not, it falls on the ones who are bringing in the income consistently. So that's what that term is that when you look at a household and the household income, it can be impacted by fluctuations in the job market and With COVID, we saw a lot of people who lost their jobs. So I see this happening a lot for different reasons, and it's super common, and it's a barrier. So if you want a 2-bedroom apartment and you can't afford that 2-bedroom apartment because only one of you is consistently employed, that's a barrier. Hopefully that makes sense. Next slide. This is an explanation of this income requirement. That is the industry standard. Just some ridiculous math on how much money our survivors would need to make. According to this national number, and I don't know if I've ever met a survivor who could live up to this standard. If you want to rent a $1,500 a month apartment, you need to be making $4,500 a month. So that also creates a barrier too, because if you're applying for a place and they require you to make this much additional income, let's say that you can cover the $1,500 a month, but you still don't make $4,500 a month, then they can turn away your application, even if you can cover that cost. So housing is ridiculously expensive. And there's a lot of hoops that people have to jump through. We just don't want to create additional hoops. We want to help them get through those. Next slide. Our barriers. So think about this when you are talking about gaps, when you're talking about needs, when you're talking about the importance of culturally specific services. When Tor talked about all of her amazing community organizing and the educational events that she's doing, she's talking about how it's culturally relevant, it's culturally supported services, it's necessary for healing. So this intersection of personal and generational trauma, racism, on all of the barriers that have been created out of biases, racism, discrimination, explaining your culture while you're in crisis is really difficult. I know that I can now talk about things like the cultural abuse. I can now talk about things like blood quantum being thrown in people's faces positively. I can talk about how we heal from these kind of things. But explaining this in crisis is impossible. It's just really difficult. And so that creates a barrier. Past experiences with systems, I would be hesitant to engage with certain systems responders still now. And so that can create a barrier. I also have like raging authority issues, which creates a barrier where I'm like, oh, a landlord is kind of like an authority figure person. So I don't like that. But the importance of confidentiality and safety is huge. We're in small communities. Everybody knows everybody. And so keeping in mind the confidentiality as much as you can possibly do that. OVW, VAWA is very strict on confidentiality, and I'm glad. A lot of people are like, oh, that's not HIPAA rules. And I'm like, no, it's stronger than HIPAA. Don't worry about HIPAA rules. You're in OVW rules now. Like even HUD, working for a HUD program, it wasn't as strict as OVW and VAWA confidentiality. We really want to keep our people safe. We slip up on confidentiality and people can die. That's just the reality of the situation. Not seeing staff or resources that reflect our culture, that reflects our community, that's really hard. I can look at a mainstream program and know right away that I can't tell you certain things. So that's a barrier for me. I know that I'll get half healing because I can't talk to you about certain things. And that's also why we don't want to do drug testing, is because if I can't talk to you about this issue that I have, I'm keeping this secret from you because I don't want to get kicked out of my house. I don't want to get kicked out of the shelter. And now I feel like I can't talk to you. I can't trust you. I can't come to you when I need help. I can't even ask for services for this because now you know. And so we really want to be as non-judgmental and not creating barriers. And there's a way that you can approach survivors in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And then this need for cultural resources and support to cope with crisis, during the crisis and after the crisis, that stabilization process. Next slide. Okay. We're going to talk about the 3 levels of advocacy, because when you're explaining what you're about to do, it's good to know why and what your approach is going to be. So there's different advocacy options, and we all have our own personal beliefs and intents. And then you'll have your organizational beliefs, intents, those kind of things. So when you think about what kind of activities you want to engage in, what are your guiding values? What are your guiding beliefs? What actions are you actually taking? A lot of people don't realize how much systems level advocacy they're doing, because again, it's that language piece. So you think that you're just doing one-on-one advocacy, but you're really working on a higher level, on this larger systems level with a lot of different practitioners, with a lot of different partners, and you're really making systems level change and you don't even realize it. Your intents, what are you trying to do? Is that reflected in what you're doing or not? How do you want to change that up? How is it affecting survivors, their families? Really the effect of what we're doing is super important. So yeah, we've got great intentions and we had this really cool project planned out, but it didn't really impact survivors that we had hoped. And that's okay. Tor talked about a lot of projects that fell through, that she just didn't have the justification for it, or the planning for it, or the time for it, those kind of things. So that's okay. And then do you need to change your strategies? Do you need a new, different response? We're all going to have our different perspectives. You're also going to have different managers who have different perspectives, and they might want to take you in a different direction. So Tor talks about how when she got a new supervisor, that the supervisor implemented the bee colony. No one else had done that before. That's also why I really like partnerships, is so you can think about new and different ideas. I think the more heads we can get together to think about solutions, the better off we are. So like they did projects where they created positions for people who were doing vocational rehab to come in and work on the bee garden. And they could do on-the-job training while they were doing that. And so it was a partnership with their vocational rehab. Then they had like a steady garden crew from that. So I also like that the way that Tor brought together different pieces with her supervisor so that it wasn't just this one and done activity. They really are a great example of how to continue building on the things that you've started. And I really like that. So she talked about in the winter when the bee colonies don't need to be tended, that they cut wood for elders. So then you've got services for elders in your community too. So you might think like, oh, we're just going to kind of create this bee colony and we'll have some honey for survivors available at the shelter. But really what they did is they built in partnerships. They created something larger. They created something that was accessible to more community members like elders. And so they were really strategic about their building process. And I like that. So next slide. All right. So individualized shelter advocacy. Shelter advocacy is going to be different than transitional housing because shelter is more crisis. So you're doing those kind of immediate needs. Any kind of advocacy you're doing will involve safety planning. That's just kind of a given. It's super, super important. Safety planning is kind of our bread and butter as advocates. Transportation assistance, if they need to get to jobs, if they need to get to medical appointments, if they need to get to legal appointments, different kind of things like that. Emergency financial assistance, they might need hygiene items, clothing, food, those kind of things. Navigation through the legal process, medical advocacy, referrals. So crisis, a lot of crisis work, a lot of what do you need right now? What do you need in the next month? Those kind of things. Next slide. Okay. This is some guidance on ways to evaluate shelter rules, and I can send this out in the email too, so it's bigger and clear and you can have it for your records. The biggest thing to get out of this is that we don't want to create any unintentional damage. We don't want to create any unintentional harm or unintended harm, to look for ways that we might have created more barriers accidentally with our good intentions. So we had really good intentions and we thought this was going to be a really great decision and it's just not working out. It's creating barriers. So thinking about that. And then another language piece. So the way that I've seen a shelter write their quote rules, they just say ask. So in their entry packet, it's we ask that you clean up after yourself. We ask that you don't let your 3-year-old cook in the kitchen, things like that, whatever their shelter guidance was or their asks were. And so that's the way that they put it. And I really like that. So people will also want to know why these are in place. So if you have shelter meetings like once a month, once a week, whatever, talk about, we ask that you do this, we ask that you don't do this, that kind of thing, and explain why, especially around confidentiality. Confidentiality is a big deal. So we ask that while you're here, you don't disclose who else is here. We ask that whatever you hear in talking circle doesn't leave talking circle, and why it's so important. Like with confidentiality, this is life and death for a lot of our survivors. So explaining why helps people get buy-in. Next slide. All right, shifting back into transitional housing. We're kind of doing a little bit jumping back and forth here. Transitional housing will have different services. They will also both have individual advocacy, the community type of advocacy, and then the systems level advocacy. So they're similar in the ways that you can build your outreach. And there are some similarities in the types of services offered, like referrals, similar. Here are the 4 pillars of a strong transitional housing program. So thinking about this language. What kind of activities could possibly be in each of these pillars? And then thinking about, well, what's holding up our pillars? The cultural practices, our teachings, our traditional life ways, our storytelling, our ceremonies. That's the foundation that's holding up these pillars. So thinking about access to cultural events, where could that fit? You might say it's recovery from violence. It's opening up traditional healing options. So that's recovery from violence, healing in a traditional way. You could also put it under safety because isolation is the glue that holds abuse together. So building your social networks builds safety. When you're doing your safety planning, who are your social networks? Who else can we get involved? who might be able to check in on your kiddos while they're at extracurriculars. Really building a social support is safety. It really is. So you can put in access to cultural events in a lot of places, and you can justify it in a lot of ways. And you can use these terms. So think about these pillars when you're justifying your unique ideas, and then use unique ideas to justify. So Tor was talking about skill building, that they were teaching how to weave and bead and how it can be a supplemental source of income. Strengthening income opportunities is economic advocacy. So you can really be unique in the way that you justify these things. You're teaching a skill, you're building in traditional healing, you're building in traditional knowledge, and it just so happens to be economic advocacy too, which is pretty cool. Next slide. So we'll start talking about the layers or the levels of advocacy. Individualized, we tend to consider that one-on-one. So here's some examples of terms that you would use to justify what you were doing. And then you can think about where they would go in those pillars. So we've got things like housing assistance with the rental subsidies, or helping them look for housing, working with landlords, helping them find other resources for housing in the community. You might do relocation assistance for them. You might do some economic advocacy with like bus passes or childcare stipends or things like that. There's a lot of different things that you can do, as long as it's justified as this is needed for transitional housing and to help their stability building, and it's not crisis. So recovery from violence and safety, you've got the safety planning, you've got personal and family strengthening activities. So you can use these kind of buzzwords to justify what you're doing. Well, see, we did this because it's family strengthening. And so that's helpful when you can use these terms when you're justifying things. You also have kind of a split in services. So there's financial services and there's more supportive services. Financial services can be easier for you to document on progress reports because it's more of a checklist kind of style. Like, yep, you got your rental subsidy this month. But thinking really about the outreach stuff that Tor talked about, those are more of the supportive services that you're not writing out a check to a landlord, but it's the supportive services that really build that healing. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about all of Tor's fun stuff. We tend to kind of use outreach and education interchangeably or as one activity, but think about your language. If you're doing both, that's great. If you did an outreach event to talk about, hey, here's who we are, here's what we do, and let's talk about cultural abuse. Let's talk about ritual abuse. Then you're doing both. You've got some outreach built into there. You've got some education built into there. And that's perfect. That's really great. Brag about it. Put that in your progress report. Absolutely pat yourself on the back when you're doing these things because they want to hear gaps. It helps us justify what we're doing, but they also want to hear successes. So absolutely brag about all of your achievements. I write a monthly progress report, just an update. It's like 2 paragraphs to my OVW program manager. Lets her know what's going on. She doesn't have to ask me what's going on because I've already sent it. I send it at the beginning of the month from the last month. And I talk about things like, hey, during COVID, this has been really rough, but we're making progress on this, and this has been really nice, and we should get it finished here. And So it's kind of a balance. But if I don't talk about those positives either, then funders start to go, well, then why are you continuing to get money? So think about that balance. Tor talked about a lot of her lessons learned with her activities that she did. She talked about how overall, and I thought this was really good for her to point out, that a lot of the education and outreach activities that she's doing is really so that people get connected to the program. We get a lot of people who are not super comfortable with going to a domestic violence programs event. So they really wanted to create a comfort around it. We'll come to this pop-up event and make jewelry. Come to this educational event and we'll feed you. You'll get to know us. She talked about the importance of people in the community thinking of you as a community member, thinking of you as not just that domestic violence program, and that it was a long path. It was something that she had to put a lot of time and effort into, but that it was really important as far as building that comfortability so that if I know someone who needs help, I can go, oh, well, I just went to this event and they seem pretty cool. So maybe they'll be like a good place for you to talk to. And so I really liked that. She talked about how the basic classes are always good. It'll get your components met. It gets your activities met. You can share a meal, not paid for by OVW, but from other, donations and other sources, things like that. They come, they share a meal, they craft, they learn a skill, they learn about power and control dynamics, different things like that. And it builds social networks. So it's part of that safety planning too. Now you know everybody who was in your beading class, and that's perfect. That's awesome. If you're running out of ideas, what's going on in your community right now? Tor talked a lot about seasons and how seasons are linked with traditional activities. So weave in those cultural practices to your outreach and educational events. Absolutely. You can make a calendar of awareness months. She found ways to celebrate different holidays, but making it specific to her community, even if it was just through language immersion. So one of her examples was that in June for Father's Day, they did a campaign that was called Our Men Are Sacred. So she made it into something that was modified to be more applicable for her area. Plan ahead for these. She has her grandkids help her make the crafts to make sure that everyone is able to make the crafts. And then when you're thinking about justification, so what are they going to learn? How can you count that as data on your report? You can just write a narrative about certain things, but also think about creative ways to document it. If you run out of ideas, we also have a transitional housing and shelter networking forum that we've been rolling out. If you're interested in joining the forum, let me know. I'll send out the link too in my follow-up email. But if you have any issues using the forum, it's on Slack. It's kind of a chat service that I think a lot of people have been using because of COVID. So you can also ask each other, get ideas for how to justify, get ideas on what new things you could do. Justification can also be the right lingo. So if you're trying to justify rental assistance, you don't want to call it transitional housing. So there can be some lingo involved. If you want to justify something as culturally specific, perfect. What does that mean? What is the link to culture? Why is it necessary? For people who don't understand culturally specific services, you could write something like, well, Our talking circle will be offered as a part of voluntary services because our services are voluntary for participants to access culturally specific healing options. The talking circles will include information on the dynamics of domestic violence, education on tribally specific power control tactics, and opportunities to build social supports to de-isolate survivors. Give a little bit of details. It helps people who don't understand. You don't have to be giving out details that make you uncomfortable. If you wanted to be more specific than that, you could talk about how healing from tribal power and control tactics, like the cultural abuse and the ritual abuse, are essential to healing. If someone is abused culturally, the healing needs to be cultural too. It's making that link. So here we've got the gap, and here's the solution. Or that your activity will provide opportunities to learn about and heal from intergenerational trauma. Historical trauma is linked to our tradition. It's linked to our culture because of the attempts that were made to eradicate it. So holistic healing will absolutely include cultural healing. Link those needs, link the gaps to your activities. Break down your who, what, when, where, why. But again, you don't have to disclose absolutely everything. If you're providing transportation to a sweat, you don't have to explain what happens at a sweat. You're providing transportation to a culturally specific activity for mental, emotional, and spiritual healing. You're good. So for supplies, we had this conference in May, and for those of you who attend conferences regularly, you might have seen that technical assistance providers, especially tribally specific technical assistance providers, we tend to have available traditional medicines at conferences. We have to justify that too. So on our conference request form, we'll create a line item. It'll say traditional medicines or traditional supplies, something like that. And then in the explanation piece, we'll kind of give a little example and why it's necessary. So like this last time we did traditional medicines will be distributed via mail, because it was a virtual conference, to each participant. It'll be sweetgrass at $4 per braid times 30 braids, $40 per pounds of sage, $20 for fabric, $15 for yarn. Traditional supplies will be utilized for participants to learn about self-care practices, traditional practices to implement into housing programming, and culturally specific ideas for healing options for survivors. We've got the gap, we've linked it to our activities, we've justified the cost. So definitely feel free to ask questions. Tor talked a lot about researching. She did the Earth Day activity where they gave out a plant. And so she needed to create like a brochure that was why this craft or why this project is important, why it's relevant, why it's meaningful to the program, to the participants, to the community, and what services they offer to create that. Here's what we do at this program too. So she talked about how she did the research on which plants would fit the best, which plants would make the most sense, which plants were more cost effective. And she did the research. She created this booklet where they talked about the plants and the benefits, and they gave out packs of seeds, and it had their outreach information on there so that people could contact them. So really building it in a way that you're not looking at it from one approach, but really, how can we make this beneficial in so many different ways? And that's your community level. But there were some things in the individual level that can also fall under the different levels and vice versa. So I talked about how you might be networking with the landlord during individual TH. That can also be stuff that you're doing for outreach. You're educating your landlords for outreach. So you might think that you're just doing this one-on-one advocacy, but really you are, by interacting with partners, you're doing this community level too. Next slide. Okay, then systems level advocacy. This is a lot of what do we need to create a larger change? Is it training? Is it resources? Is it tools? Is it policies? Is it laws? What could help lower domestic violence rates? What could help lower sexual assault rates on a large scale? So there are some different ways to do it. There's some different ways to get other people involved. There's different partners that you might want to get involved. And for those of you who are doing CCR work, which is the coordinated community responses, where you have like a multidisciplinary team, that's what you're doing with these teams, is you're looking at these system levels. You're looking at how we do what we do, how we all work together, what can be improved. If you're finding gaps there, well, how can we address it? I had someone call me and say that law enforcement weren't investigating cyber crimes or cyberbullying. And I'm like, well, what do your tribal codes say? And she's like, well, we don't have any. Well, that's why law enforcement can't investigate that, is because there's no code in the books for them to follow. So it's the system level change so that it is able to be responded to. So thinking about those kind of things. So if you're working in like a multidisciplinary team, this is stuff that you're going to be looking at. When you write a proposal, you'll be stating your needs and how you're planning on filling them. You can really be working with your partners on this too. What are they seeing? What are they noticing? How can we educate each other on what we're seeing and what we know, so that you can kind of get a larger picture? I know that I've never worked for a housing authority. I would absolutely want to partner with a housing authority if I was working direct services still in housing, because I don't have that knowledge. I can research stuff, but there's also this experience that comes from doing the job for a long time. So I can get some, oh, I know that you need to do this, and this is a requirement for your job. But someone who's been doing it is going to get more than just this generic version that's been watered down from not having done it. Systems level work is a lot easier with partners. So I definitely encourage all of you to build out partnerships and think about how we can help each other. Think about how it can be beneficial, not just to us, but to our survivors and the people in our community. And then start thinking about how survivors can get involved in this too. There's a lot of survivors who, as they heal, as we heal, we start telling our stories in our own ways and in different ways, and it might change throughout the years. Some survivors get really into systems level advocacy and activism in general. And so this can be something that survivors really get into too. So those are the 3 levels. There's a little bit of blending, and that's a good thing. But if you want to brag about how you're doing your systems level advocacy, think about how you're doing these things, and then you have the language for it. You can say you're doing system level advocacy. You're not just using, oh, I'm in an MDT. So think about the different language that you're using to brag about yourself. or when you're asking for things that you need. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about partnering on housing specifically, this kind of systems level changes that can happen. We had this conference back in May, and it was called HEART, the Housing and Advocate Response Teams. And we'll have those recordings up actually really soon on our website too. The focus was really on building partnerships for the system level change. Working on VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, is a really, really good place to start with really any partner. A lot of people don't know what VAWA is, honestly. I had some vague notion of what VAWA was back when I was working in housing, but definitely not the intricacies and all of the ways that it protects, all of the ways that it regulates, those kind of rules and regulations. I really didn't know the ins and outs of it. So VAWA includes protections for survivors in federal housing programs. The intent is to encourage survivors who are getting housing subsidies to be able to report and to seek help for abuse committed against them without being afraid of those ramifications, like being evicted. We see victims getting blamed for things the abuser has done all the time. And in housing, this happens a lot where the survivor is evicted for property damage. So VAWA is really about protecting survivors who are applying for these programs, who are living in these programs, from being discriminated against. So part of the regulations is that survivors can't be denied admission or evicted because they've experienced victimization. They can't be denied admission, rental assistance, they can't be evicted, they can't lose their subsidy also because of reasons related to the abuse. So even if they're not going to be evicted, if the landlord wants the survivor to pay for property damage after evicting the perpetrator, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. The perpetrator is responsible for perpetrating crimes. We have to hold the right person accountable, and that's what VAWA is saying. Housing providers can offer VAWA protections even if they're not required to, but if they're getting $1 of VAWA money, they have to. These policies on this slide are a really great place, even if people aren't required to do these things, it's a great place to start. There's no harm in implementing more protection for people. Housing authorities, they have to do these things because they are getting federal funds. But it's good for advocates. If you don't know that your housing authorities are doing these things, it's good for you to know too. I thought that I could add files to the chat in here, but I can't. So I will send these example files in my follow-up email so that you have those. You can search for them on Google too if you want more information. So this notice of occupancy rights, it really talks about what VAWA protects, including the rest of these sections, these policies. The self-certification, so if a survivor is wanting VAWA protections from a housing provider, that provider can ask them to give a written request that gives self-documentation of the incident or incidents of violence. So that's what that is. Confidentiality, again, VAWA is much clearer, much stricter than things like HIPAA. They can be enforced in programs outside of VAWA too. It's not a bad thing to protect more confidentially. It's really not. Emergency transfer plans. So example, your survivor fled, but the abuser found them. If there's other units available, sometimes there's not, a lot of times there's not. But if there are other units available, then the survivor could request an emergency transfer. I would encourage you to ask your housing authority what their emergency transfer plan is. That would be interesting for you to know what that plan is for them. lease bifurcations or any kind of addendums. So that example, your victim is living with the abuser. Maybe they're in permanent housing. They're getting some sort of housing subsidy from the housing authority. If the abuser damages enough property, they are going to get evicted. The victim can request a lease bifurcation, which is a split, so that they don't get evicted and they aren't blamed for their own abuse. So the abuser will be removed from the lease, they will be removed from the unit, and the victim can stay. That's a lease bifurcation. It's splitting one person off of the lease. Any questions there? If you have questions later too, please reach out. If you start talking, advocates talking to housing authorities, if you start talking to advocates and you have questions, 2 years down the road, so ask us. That's what Redwind is here for. Next slide. Okay, thinking about your day-to-day partnering on VAWA. And again, this is systems level stuff. You're advocating for survivors. You're advocating on the housing systems level. You're advocating on a legal level because you're talking about enforcement of VAWA. So you're really doing a lot of things here. Advocates have a lot of training and recognize how to respond and address domestic violence. That's knowledge that can be shared. I have personal experience when I was working in housing and I didn't have that knowledge. So it would have been really nice at that time if I had partnered with an advocate who could have given me more information. I would have made different choices. I talk about this massive regret that I was a part of when I was at the shelter where young lady was in there with her boyfriend. She would come back with bruises every day. We knew what was going on, but she did not disclose what was going on. So we just supported her. Like, we're here to talk. But he went to go and visit family. And while he was gone, she came to us and was like, yeah, absolutely. This is abuse and I need help. Because we didn't have a partnership with an advocate, our solution was to send her on a Greyhound bus back to her family, because she said her family would be a safe place for her. Had we been partnered with an advocate, I'm sure the advocate could have come up with, well, first of all, let's safety plan. Let's get some safety planning in here before we make more steps, so that you're safe right now. But also just different options that would have been really good for us all to know. It can be really, really helpful. No matter what program you're in, it can be really, really helpful when you're seeking different supports and services, if you're making referrals, and for your own knowledge and for survivors to have more access to safety and so they have more access to options. It's really helpful. So advocates, you can meet with landlords, your tribal housing authorities, other kind of leasing offices, and all of your partners. Talk to them about different policy changes that might be able to help survivors. Housing authorities might be able to prioritize housing domestic violence survivors. They can create their priority list. So there's different things that you can work together on. You can think about how partners are trained on domestic violence, how partners are trained on the Violence Against Women Act, how they're notifying people of those policies that was on the last slide. How do people know about their rights under VAWA? And then what is the protocol for partners who do become aware that a participant or a tenant is experiencing domestic violence? So yeah, cross-training within any multidisciplinary team is always awesome. You can learn more about each other's roles, responsibilities, confidentiality requirements. Those are all really important things. But the day-to-days, there's different ways that we can work together and open doors for survivors. So again, thinking about this kind of language, thinking about how you can justify, if you don't feel like you can justify the time talking to your housing authority, you can think about these kind of, it's important because of VAWA, it's important because of systems level advocacy for me to spend this time doing this work. Because a lot of people think, well, I was just tired to do this one-on-one stuff. But the systems level work is important for breaking down those barriers on this higher level of a system. So yeah, you can justify a lot of different things. If you need help with language, let me know, reach out to Redwind. We have our other projects, so reach out to us if you're like, how exactly should I justify this? Or how should I write this on my progress report? We can help with those kind of things. Next slide. All right. So make sure that what you're doing is meaningful and relevant to your community. You can get feedback. We have examples or samples of survivor surveys that you can send out to ask for feedback. And it can be your one-on-one feedback, like how did we do, or it can be a systems level feedback. How did all of the systems respond? Really listen to your community. Tor talked about listening to the seasons, listening to your place and your time. How do we fill the needs of our community members? Every skill that we build, every piece of knowledge, every tool that is provided can really help address the root of violence and help people heal. So a lot of the activities that we do, and the cultural activities specifically, because there is such a huge gap in cultural activities, there really is. When we give them some cultural skill, activity, knowledge that lets them grab on to their natural way of being, bringing back balance, restoring harmony, we can absolutely help heal and decrease violence. So all of this work is super important. And we're really making a huge impact on our communities. We really want community healing. We heal together, we grieve together. So keeping your community at the forefront of your mind when you're making these decisions. I talked about how you'll have your own belief system and your organization will have a different belief system maybe. So keep in mind your community. And next slide. All right, this is my email address. If you have questions, please reach out. I will send a follow-up email with different resources after this gets posted. If you didn't get to check out Tor's part 1, if you check that out and then you have questions after that, reach out. Yeah, and so as a part of the housing and homeless TA that we do the conferences, the transitional housing policies. Part of the reason that we get so many questions about that is because we are a part of the official review for OVW to accept your transitional housing policy. We have an official process. We have an official review form that we will give to you as a part of the review process so that you can send that in with your policy to OVW to tell them you went through the process. We can look through other policies too, but the transitional housing one is required to go through Redwind. Yeah, so reach out when you need resources on shelters, housing. We also have the Children and Youth Project. We have an elder abuse project. We have an urban project, and we have a tribal campus project. So reach out when things come up. We can help you brainstorm. We can give you feedback. We do a lot of different things. So I tell people like we're kind of like your team from across the country. So we're here. to help you start new projects, to help you build projects, to help you create flyers for projects, all kinds of different things. So yeah, thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you, Annette. Before we end the session, I want to let you know that there will be a survey popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you are able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. I'd like to thank our presenter, Wyanet, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar. Thank you.